At age 11 they began singing together. They didn't talk to each other for decades. We now understand why. Art Garfunkel got all the praise while Paul Simon wrote all the songs. Simon did something terrible when he finally lost it. He took Garfunkel's voice off of their comeback record and put it out as his own work. But that wasn't the real point where things broke. There was something much more personal going on. Paul Simon first saw Art Garfunkel sing in a fourth-grade talent show at Public School 164 in Queens in 1953. He was only 11 years old at the time. They lived just a few blocks away in an area that was mostly Jewish. It wasn't until a sixth-grade play of Alice in Wonderland that they really got to know each other. Paul was the white rabbit. Art looked like a Cheshire cat. Art remembers that he thought Paul was the coolest, funniest and smartest kid in school. Their shared love of music brought them together right away. They would listen to the radio for hours on end, taking in the new rock and roll sounds. They quickly got together with some friends to start a small street corner singing group, which they called the Peptones. They worked on duets and learned how to make their voices sound good together. Soon they were acting together at school events, which was the start of the relationship that would make them famous one day. They chose to record a song called Hey Schoolgirl in 1957, when they were both only 15 years old. They got $25 together and went to Manhattan's Sanders recording studio. They had good luck. A music producer named Sid Prozan heard them and liked what he heard. He talked their parents into letting him sign the boys to Big Records, his own record label. After seeing the cartoon they came up with the catchy name Tom and Jerry. They were thrilled when a famous DJ played their song on the radio. Hey Schoolgirl made it onto the Billboard lists and sold more than 100,000 copies. Back then it was a big deal that they got to be on American Bandstand. But that early spark didn't quickly turn into long-term success. Their next songs didn't do well, and people stopped being as excited about them. It was still a taste of what could be. Their relationship wasn't always hard, even before they became famous. Years before, in 1958, there was a terrible event that neither of them would forget. Once they were done with high school, both of them chose to go to college in case their singing dreams didn't come true. Paul Simon went to Queens College to study English, and Art Garfunkel first studied design at Columbia University but later switched to art history. To that time they were still signed to big records as Tom and Jerry. Simon went by the name Jerry Landis, and Garfunkel went by the name Tom Graff. But Simon did something that made their friendship fall apart. He recorded and put out a solo song under the fake name True Taylor without telling Garfunkel. True or False was a secret song release. When Garfunkel learned about it, he felt lied to. It would come back to them many times over the years. Even decades later, Simon admitted the memory still hurt, especially when he recalled Garfunkel once saying, "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you." Years passed, and the folk music scene in early 1960s, America gave them a reason to reconnect. It was a time when polished pop was being replaced by more raw emotional folk songs. In 1963, 5 years after their split, they quietly started performing again, but they didn't use their real names. Instead they called themselves Kane and Gar, and played small venues in Greenwich Village, like Gota's Folk City. Everything changed when Tom Wilson, a well-known African-American jazz musician and producer, saw them perform. Wilson, who was also helping Bob Dylan move from folk to rock, saw something special in them. He got them a studio audition. Either they played The Sound of Silence, a haunting song Simon had written in his bathroom, with the lights off and the water running to get just the right sound. They signed with Columbia Records under their real names and began again. It was perfect timing. Folk music was becoming more poetic and political, just as Simon's songwriting was growing deeper. But their first official album didn't go well. Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. was released in October 1964 and barely sold. Only 3,000 copies were bought. The label had misread the moment, calling it exciting new sounds in the folk tradition, just as the Beatles and other British bands were taking over with electric guitars and rock rhythms. Most of the songs weren't even Simon originals, and the album felt old-fashioned overnight. Crushed by the failure, Simon moved to England to figure things out as a solo artist. Garfunkel went back to Columbia University to study math. It seemed like the end. Simon even recorded a solo album in London. Both of them moved on. or so they thought. Then something strange happened. In the spring of 1965, college radio stations in Boston and Florida started playing the original version of The Sound of Silence. Tom Wilson noticed. Without asking the duo, he decided to remix the song. Using studio musicians, he added electric guitars, bass and drums to the original recording. But the track wasn't smooth. Because the original had tempo issues, the session players struggled to keep time. The engineer, Roy Haley, had to use echo effects to hide the uneven rhythm. In September, while Simon was performing in Denmark, he learned the remixed song was climbing the US charts. When he finally heard it, he was horrified. He thought it sounded messy and awkward, but the public disagreed. The song reached #1 on January 1, 1966, after 14 weeks on the Billboard Top 100. Suddenly Simon and Garfunkel were famous. And just like that, they were forced back together to record a new album, Sounds of Silence, riding the wave of an unexpected hit. In October 1966, Simon and Garfunkel released their third album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme. It was a big turning point for them. The album stayed on the Billboard charts for nearly 3 years, and sold over 3 million copies. For the first time, they used an 8-track recording system, which let them layer their vocals cleanly without sound from Paul Simon's guitar getting in the way. The result was a much more polished sound, but there were some behind-the-scenes issues too. The song Scarborough Fair came from an old English folk tradition that Simon had learned from a musician named Martin Carthy. Even though it was a centuries-old song, it was only credited to Simon and Garfunkel. Another song, Cloudy, was co-written with Bruce Woodley of The Seekers. He got paid, but didn't get a credit on the album. Despite all that, the album was a major success. Years later, it was added to the Grammy Hall of Fame, and ranked as one of the greatest albums of all time by Rolling Stone magazine. In June 1967, Simon and Garfunkel performed at the Monterey Pop Festival. It was a huge cultural event, with artists like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who stealing the show. While others smashed guitars and lit them on fire, Simon and Garfunkel stood out in a different way. Their gentle, thoughtful sound reminded people of their folk roots in the middle of all the chaos and psychedelia. Some thought their music wasn't hip enough for the moment, but their performance proved they still had a powerful place in the changing music scene. That same year, something unexpected happened that would change both their careers and the world of film. Director Mike Nichols was working on The Graduate, and had a sudden idea. He wanted to use Simon and Garfunkel's songs instead of a traditional soundtrack. At first, Paul Simon agreed to write 3 new songs for the film, but touring got in the way. Instead, the movie's editor just used existing songs like The Sound of Silence and Scarborough Fair while cutting scenes. The music fits so well, they decided to keep it. The movie and the music lifted each other up. The soundtrack became a massive hit, even competing with the Beatles on the charts. Mrs. Robinson, the one new song Simon wrote for the film, went on to win Record of the Year. Their music helped give the movie its emotional core, and in return the film gave Simon and Garfunkel a wider, older audience. This approach to using popular music in movies would inspire many filmmakers in the years to come. But behind all the success, cracks were starting to show. The duo's working relationship was becoming uneven. Paul Simon was writing all the songs and making most of the creative decisions while Art Garfunkel mainly focused on singing. Simon later admitted that he felt the imbalance. During recording sessions, Garfunkel would often sit in the control room and give feedback, but Simon was doing most of the heavy lifting. This led to feelings of resentment. Simon once admitted he felt jealous when crowds cheered loudly for Garfunkel's vocals on songs like Bridge Over Troubled Water. He thought to himself, "I wrote that song, yet it was Garfunkel who got the applause." That frustration went back to their childhood. Simon remembered his mother telling him, "You have a good voice, Paul, but Arthur has a fine voice." It stung. As time went on, the tension grew. Garfunkel didn't write any of the music, but felt like he was being overshadowed. Simon, meanwhile, felt boxed in creatively. In January 1969, Simon and Garfunkel were getting ready to make what would become their final album. Around the same time, Art Garfunkel made a choice that changed everything. Both he and Paul Simon had been cast in the movie Catch-22, directed by Mike Nichols. But unexpectedly, Simon's role was cut from the script. Filming started on January 13th in Guaymas, Mexico, with only Garfunkel in the cast. That left Simon behind in New York, alone and hurt. Director Charles Grattan later called this the moment their partnership began to fall apart. "You don't take Simon and Garfunkel and drop one of their roles," he said. "You just don't do that." For Simon, it wasn't just about the film. It was about feeling left behind by someone he had been best friends with for years. When they finally talked, Garfunkel explained his plan. He would do movies for 6 months, then come back and record albums. But Simon wasn't okay with that. As he recalled in the documentary In Restless Dreams, he told Garfunkel, "No, that's not gonna happen. I'm not gonna do that." Simon was already doing the heavy lifting in their music. He wrote all the songs, led the recording sessions, and shaped their sound. Garfunkel mostly sang, and gave feedback from the control room. To Simon, it felt like the partnership wasn't equal anymore, and this film only made things worse. Garfunkel's 6-week film shoot turned into a months-long production. While he was stuck in Mexico, Simon tried to move forward with the album Bridge Over Troubled Water, but the long-distance collaboration didn't work. Simon would send songs, Garfunkel would send back notes. It wasn't the same. Everything felt off. The delay pushed Simon to finish parts of the album without Garfunkel. On some tracks, Garfunkel barely appears. On others, not at all. One of the songs, The Only Living Boy in New York, became a kind of goodbye letter. Simon wrote it about Garfunkel using their old stage names as a reference. "Tom, get your plane right on time. I know your part will go fine. Fly down to Mexico." That song captured how alone Simon felt, and how far apart the two had grown. Not just physically, but emotionally too. When Simon and Garfunkel performed their famous song, Bridge Over Troubled Water live, something happened that always bothered Paul Simon. Every time the crowd heard Art Garfunkel sing the soaring emotional part of the song, they jumped to their feet and cheered wildly. The applause was loud and full of admiration, but it was all for Garfunkel. And every time Simon had the same bitter thought, "I wrote that song." In the 2024 documentary In Restless Dreams, Simon speaks honestly about how painful those moments were. He had given the lead vocal to Garfunkel on purpose, because he believed Garfunkel's clear choir-like voice was perfect for it. Still, it hurt. People celebrated the voice they heard, not the person who created the music and lyrics. Over time, those performances became a constant reminder that he was the writer in the background, while Garfunkel got the spotlight. This frustration wasn't new for Simon. It had roots in his childhood. He remembers something his mother once said that stuck with him for life. She told him, "You have a good voice, Paul, but Arthur has a fine voice." To him, that simple sentence became a deep wound. It made him feel like he was always second best. Every time critics or fans praised Garfunkel's voice, that old comment came back. And as Simon watched their fame grow in the late 1960s, when he was writing all their songs, he also watched Garfunkel receive more praise than he did. That imbalance became too much to bear. But Garfunkel had his own struggles. In an interview, he admitted that Paul Simon was in the way for a large part of his life. Garfunkel had wanted to write songs too, but felt overshadowed. He said he never even tried to add his songs during their years as a duo, because he didn't think they could measure up to Simon's. For decades, he stayed silent about it, only starting to write and release his own material decades later. In the documentary, he raises a tough question. Was he the one who broke up the group, or was Simon the one who never made space for Garfunkel's own ambitions? He believed that both of them shared the blame. Eventually, Simon admitted that their partnership was never equal. He was the one writing the songs and leading the recording sessions. He made most of the decisions about how everything should sound, from the guitar parts to the drums. Garfunkel mostly stayed in the control room with the producer, giving his approval but rarely shaping the music. Things got worse during the recording of Bridge Over Troubled Water. Garfunkel left to act in the movie Catch-22, and the filming took longer than expected. Simon grew frustrated when Garfunkel couldn't return in time to finish the album. The delay, the creative tension, and the imbalance between them all added up. In the summer of 1970, at Forest Hills Stadium in Queens, New York, something quiet but important happened. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel stood on stage together for what would turn out to be their final concert as a duo. The crowd had no idea this night would mark the end of one of music's most beloved partnerships. The show was polished and professional, but there was a strange feeling in the air, something distant, something missing. There wasn't much talking between songs. The usual warmth and jokes between the two seemed to have vanished. After the second night, they simply said goodbye to each other. No dramatic fight, no public announcement, just a quiet personal farewell that felt more like closing a door than slamming it. Paul Simon later shared that they never really talked about ending the act, it just ended. With Artie, there was no reason to talk about it. He said years later, that sentence alone says a lot. The way they communicated had broken down long before they stopped singing together. Maybe they both knew things couldn't go on the way they had been. Maybe silence was easier than saying what they really felt. After the split, their lives moved in different directions. Paul Simon jumped headfirst into his solo career. He didn't just survive, he thrived. His early albums in the 1970s, like Paul Simon, There Goes Rhymin' Simon, and Still Crazy, after all these years were filled with new energy and fresh ideas. Songs like Me and Julio, Down by the Schoolyard and 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover became hits. People saw that Simon wasn't just part of a great duo. He was a powerful songwriter in his own right. His creativity kept pushing forward, and in 1986 he released Graceland, an album that blended South African music with his own style. It sold millions of copies, and won more Grammy Awards. It wasn't just successful, it was groundbreaking. Art Garfunkel, on the other hand, had a harder time. His voice was still as beautiful as ever, but his solo music didn't catch on the same way. He released several albums during the 1970s, but none of them reached the heights of what he and Simon had created together. His music career became quieter, more scattered, and while fans still loved his voice, he struggled to find the same magic on his own. He wasn't done creating, but the spotlight moved on. Oddly enough, Garfunkel's acting career worked out better than expected. He got praise for his performances in both Catch-22 and Carnal Knowledge. Critics called him a natural actor with a strong presence. People were surprised. Even Simon, years later, admitted feeling bitter about the attention Garfunkel got. In one biography, he's quoted talking about how everyone said Artie had so much talent, so much feeling, and yes, even pointed out how handsome he was. You could hear the frustration in Simon's words. After all the music they had made together, the person he once sang with was now being praised for something entirely different. Looking back, their breakup wasn't just about music, it reflected something deeper happening in the world. Simon and Garfunkel's songs had helped shape the 1960s. Their music spoke to people searching for meaning, fighting for justice, and dreaming of a better world. Tracks like The Sound of Silence didn't just entertain, they made people think. Their 1968 album Bookends captured the feeling of growing up, facing the world, and wondering where it was all going. Their voices became the background of a generation that believed in change. But by 1970, the world was shifting. The protests, the hope, the unity of the 60s, it was all starting to fade. People were turning inward. The big movements were becoming personal journeys. The duo's final album, Bridge Over Troubled Water, was more than just a record. It was like a goodbye to one era, and the beginning of another. The title track itself, full of comfort and sorrow, seemed to speak to that change. It stayed at the top of the charts for years, just as society was learning to live with a different kind of music, and a different kind of hope. After their bitter split in 1970, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel reunited in 1975 for a song called My Little Town. It was their first major collaboration since they went their separate ways, but instead of coming together as a true duo, they recorded the song separately, each releasing it on their own solo albums. The song did well. It reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and topped the adult contemporary chart for 2 weeks. Still, the reunion felt more like a business move than a heartfelt comeback. Simon even said he wrote the song to have a darker tone, telling Garfunkel he was singing too many sweet songs. They performed it on Saturday Night Live, but went back to their own careers soon after. Simon's album won a Grammy, but their brief moment together didn't heal any old wounds. It only made it clearer how different they had become. A few years later, in 1981,
They tried again. This time it was a huge concert in Central Park. 500,000 people showed up to see them perform. It was one of the biggest concerts in U.S. history. The event was meant to raise money and attention for the park, and it turned into a cultural milestone. They played 21 songs, starting with Mrs. Robinson. As the sky darkened over New York, fans loved it, and the success led to a world tour. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. Garfunkel later said it was thrilling to be in front of such a huge crowd, but Simon admitted that during most of the tour, they didn't speak to each other. Even with all the cheers and applause, their personal problems were still right there between them. Then came one of the most painful chapters in 1983. After their Central Park success, they started working on a new album together called Think Too Much, but the old tensions came back. Garfunkel carefully recorded his vocal parts, but Simon grew impatient with how long it was taking. Then, out of nowhere, he called Garfunkel and told him he was removing his vocals from the album. Garfunkel later said he couldn't understand why Simon would do such a thing. An engineer confirmed that every trace of Garfunkel's voice was wiped from the master tapes. When the album was released that November, it came out as a Paul Simon solo project called Hearts and Bones. Garfunkel's voice survived only on bootlegs shared among die-hard fans, including a haunting solo on Song About the Moon. The betrayal cut deep, and it added another crack to a relationship already full of them. By 1993, things had gone from bad to worse. The two tried to perform together again in New York, but the attempt quickly collapsed. A critic's review that referred to Garfunkel as just one of many collaborators on stage hit a nerve. That small comment lit a fuse. The tension backstage grew so intense that it turned physical. Simon's business manager later said he was scared someone might actually get stabbed if a knife had been nearby. There were reports of shoving and yelling, and the crew worried it might spill onto the stage. These fights showed that even after 20 years, the pain and resentment hadn't faded. In fact, they had only gotten stronger. Two men in their 50s, still caught in the same battles they had been fighting since they were young. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel met when they were just 11 years old. They were schoolboys in Queens, New York, singing together in junior high plays and on street corners. Back then, their bond was about music, friendship, and the thrill of performing. No one could have predicted how famous they'd become, or how bitter things would eventually get. As they rose to fame, something quiet but powerful began to grow between them. Resentment. One of the things that haunted Paul Simon deeply was his height. It seems like a small thing, but to him it wasn't. He remembered one moment in particular, decades later, when Garfunkel teased, "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you." It stung so badly. Simon never forgot it. It wasn't just a joke. Simon had already been struggling with insecurities and self-doubt. He went through years of therapy, and being short was one of the things he focused on. What made it worse was that Garfunkel seemed to know. In a later interview, he admitted that as a kid, he had partly befriended Simon out of pity for his height. He said he offered Paul love and friendship as compensation, and then added something chilling. That compensation gesture has created a monster. Their height difference became a symbol of something deeper, a power imbalance. Paul wrote the songs, Artie sang them, but the audience often saw Garfunkel as the star. Their manager even said Paul sometimes felt overshadowed when fans cheered wildly for Artie's voice, even though the songs were his. Despite the tension, their shared history kept them tied together. They had gone from recording a small single for $25 in 1957 to becoming global stars by 1970. That kind of journey is rare, and the pressure was enormous. In a recent documentary, Simon called Garfunkel his oldest friend and admitted the fame had taken its toll. Still, cracks showed early. In 1958, not long after their first success, Simon secretly recorded solo material without telling Garfunkel. That betrayal never really healed. Even 60 years later, Garfunkel brought it up, saying he was shocked and hurt that Simon kept it a secret. Their split was never just about business. It was personal, messy, emotional, and filled with unresolved pain. Garfunkel questioned who was really to blame, once asking aloud, "Am I the one who broke up Simon and Garfunkel, or is Paul the one who failed to accommodate Garfunkel's enriching of his own career?" He seemed frustrated that people saw him as just Simon's voice rather than an equal partner. Eventually, he admitted something painful. I did hurt his feelings, and I wanted to. Simon, meanwhile, had already come to a different conclusion. For him, their breakup was inevitable. In an interview, he said, "Duos don't stay together." He compared their split to other legendary breakups, Lennon and McCartney, the Everly Brothers, and when duos reunite, he said, "It's not about the music, it's about the business." Still, they kept coming back together, at least for a while. Their 1981 reunion concert in Central Park drew over 500,000 people, but by 2016, Simon had no more patience. "We don't get along," he said bluntly. "It's not fun." When a final tour in 2010 had to be cancelled due to Garfunkel's vocal issues, Simon took it as the last straw. "He let us all down," he said. "I didn't feel I could trust him anymore." In the end, their story was one of brilliance, beauty, and bitterness. Two boys from Queens changed music history, but couldn't outrun the pain that came with growing up together and growing apart.